All right, y'all. Welcome to the Three View Mirror podcast. As we always say, the podcast that as of yet you may not have realized you need in your life, but if you stick with us through one episode where we bring to you three seemingly random topics and tie them together in the end in a way that brings the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s alive again, we hope, we think, we pray you'll be hooked. I am joined by two amazing co-hosts today. Chelle Oblak and Chris Clues. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves real quick?
I am Chelle Oblak, and I have a passion for 70s, 80s, and 90s pop culture, just like the both of you. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, and that's it.
I'm Chris Clues. I'm a keynote speaker and author, and I write and talk about the life and work lessons that we can learn from 80s pop culture, the greatest decade for pop culture. I do love the 70s and 90s, but my heart is in the 80s. And you can find me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter.
My name is John Katrides. I can also be found on all social media platforms. TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. You can also find the Three View Mirror across the same platforms, especially Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Please check us out and subscribe so you'll be notified whenever one of our new episodes hits the platforms. Today, I am your host, which means that I have collected, researched, done painstaking amounts of work this week, which basically means I thought this whole thing up 10 minutes ago. But I'm excited for the three topics I'm bringing to the table today. And up until this very moment, neither Chris nor Chelle have any idea what I'm bringing in today. So they are just as in the dark as all of you are. Let's see if you can determine what connects these three topics before they do. And without any further ado, as they say, our three topics this week are science fiction television, action figures, and Sandra Bullock.
Well, when you say seemingly random, you certainly mean it. That's for sure.
I nailed the random. So let's get to it. So here we go. Now, Chelle, I was especially excited for the first of these three topics for you, because I know that you, like me, are a little bit of a science fiction television junkie, at least when it came to the Star Trek franchise. Now, I'm not sure if you watched the original series like I did as a kid, but I know you were a fan of the 80s Next Generation franchise. Yes? No?
Yes. I did watch most of... I was hooked on that franchise there for a little while. I think I actually watched it more in the 90s than I did in the 80s. I have no idea when it actually came out. But of course, it went into, syndication. And I watched probably every episode.
So the thing about it that I wanted to bring, and this is actually my 70s portion of the topics, because the 70s were like, I think technology on television finally got to the point where they were able to introduce science fiction in a way that looked somewhat realistic. I mean, Star Trek was, of course, in the 60s, but I know a lot of us kids saw it more in reruns than it ever really played out in its original run, because it was canceled and actually did better with us kids in syndication when it ran on reruns. But there was There was Star Trek. We saw Battlestar Galactica. The 80s brought to us Buck Rogers in the 25th century. There was Flash Gordon, the movie. I mean, yes. What else do you guys remember in the 70s and even into the 80s with that kitschy sci-fi type television?
Listen, Flash Gordon goes down in my books as one of those movies. I could still watch it to this day. We've talked about movies that I could quote, and there are different portions of that movie that I could quote all day long.
I just always think of Flash Gordon or something like that. However, when I was like, I can't. I'm so bad.
Wait. Flash.
Yeah, that's it. Flash. Gordon. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, and I actually got to meet the actor. Can't think of his name off the top of my head right now. At a Comic-Con that I was speaking at in LA back in 2019, and everybody said he's like the nicest guy in the world, and he absolutely is. And his booth was constantly busy because Flash Gordon is just, it's iconic, and it's just kind of Americana. And I think it is one of those, even when I think of sci-fi television, that, Flash Gordon was the one that came to my head first, even before Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica. And I think, again, it's just as a kid being a boy, 9, 10, 11 years old, 12 years old, Flash Gordon was, on my lunchbox, and I had a Flash Gordon t-shirt, and he was as nice as they say he was. And that was pretty cool.
You mentioned about John, you mentioned about the technology portion of things from the 60s, and that by the 70s, things had finally started to look maybe a tad bit more realistic. When I go backwards and I look, I think that's kind of a misnomer, because they didn't look that way. But we were just, for us, it was so fascinating to see these things. They used toys to fly them through the air and such. And I think we thought that was a grand leap forward in technology, when in fact you go back and you look in the days of right now of CGI and AI, but we thought they were. We really, truly thought that technology they were flying in space.
Well, and when you look at Star Trek specifically, I guess that's what I mean on the technology. Think of the original series in the 60s. Think of even Star Trek the Motion Picture, the first Star Trek movie that came out. And then look what happened with Next Generation. Next Generation had movie-sized budgets for the special effects. I mean, it was a huge leap forward. In Star Trek, the original series, they had two guys behind the scenes, each pulling on the door to open them. And then they added the sound effect, because they didn't have the technology at the time that we find in supermarkets and stores where the doors open for us. They actually had people pulling those doors open. The teleportation scenes was literally water and glitter in water being stirred. And then they overlaid that over the image of the people standing there as they freeze-framed them. But Next Generation had true special effects, and it was a huge leap forward at that point.
Yeah, that's and I think we look back too, and some of the reasons that it still feels, kitschy even after, when we get into the 80s, is because Star Wars. I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, but it was on the other day, and I was kind of just, it was in the background. But watching the special effects, I'm just not. Watching the special effects, I couldn't believe that I was 1977, I think. Pretty impressive. And, when you think about what Star Trek was doing in Battlestar Galactica and the others, and then you see what they did with Star Wars, and I think it was on a different level in terms of the special effects. And I think it made them even look more, when we go back and watch them, more kitschy, I guess is the best word to use.
And then I think backwards, you had mentioned Buck Rogers, and I was thinking of the little robot, and Chris, you probably remember, I cannot think of his name at the moment.
Bitty, 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 bitty.
Then it made me think of my other favorite sci-fi robot on television, and that was from the, Danger, Will Robinson, Danger.
Oh, yeah, Lost in Space.
Lost in Space. And, a lot of these shows have gotten reboots. There was a current reboot of Lost in Space, which is actually pretty decent. But the older versions of it, I watched that in black and white all the way up through the 70s. And that was early 60s show? I don't even know.
Yeah, we watched a lot of it. There was Arc 2, was a Saturday morning science fiction show. There was Land of the Lost, which was set in the future and an apocalypse. There was $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman that was big on sci-fi. Wonder Woman and her reboot went from being like a World War II era superhero show to really a science fiction show in a way, because then she started working for the CIA type organization, and they had their little robot that went running around, if you remember. And, she had aliens coming, and a lot of that went towards sci-fi in the 70s. It was a really big deal. And us kids played constantly. Who didn't jump like Wonder Woman, or like, girls jumping like Jamie Summers, and guys pretending they were Lee Majors? And I had those lunch boxes.
We do really slow.
We played
run.
Star Trek with phasers and communicators. And now we have a lot of that stuff.
And, John, the whole reason for that science fiction move was that in the, you think about 1969, landing of the moon, there is actually, and I can't remember where I saw this at, but it was at a museum, might have been on the National Mall somewhere, where there was an entire toy history about the cultural explosion of the space race that continued throughout the 70s. And that space race was one of the reasons that you saw a lot of things heading towards Buck Rogers or fantasies about going out into space.
Yeah, and you guys were mentioning robots. My favorite robot was not in a sci-fi movie, but it was Bobo the Owl from Clash of the Titans. It was like the little owl, the mechanical owl, Bobo. That was my favorite. And and in the reboot, they actually had a Bobo the Owl. He opened up a chest at one point, and there's Bobo in there. So they did a little Easter egg for those of us that love the original one. But I want to just keep going on Chelle's point here about the fascination with space exploration and sci-fi, because it really even goes back further. Like we look at H.G. Wells, for example, and what he was writing with The Time Machine and other books. And I'm sure there's like one obvious one that's slipping my mind right now. But I think about H.G. Wells. Then I think about War of the Worlds on the radio in was that the early, like 1940 or 39, when people thought we were literally being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so they did that radio show and people thought we were legitimately being attacked by aliens.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, then they get to the point where now there's television and they can actually take these things and create them and put them into a different medium. Of course, people are going to be excited about it. I even think about Back to the Future. What was McFly reading when Marty went back in time to the 50s? What was he fascinated by?
Was it the Time Machine?
He was fascinated by sci-fi comic books and aliens.
So
remember, Marty dressed up as an alien, like from the cover of his comic book, to tell him that he had to, ask. Oh my God, her name is going to slip my mind. The mom.
It's been a lot of years, Chris. We forgive you.
Lorraine?
The audience forgives you.
Lorraine, right? The mom, Lorraine. Yeah.
The mom was Lorraine.
Yeah. So. But he dressed up as the alien on the cover of the comic book that McFly was reading.
Yeah, he was wearing the hazmat suit, right? The yellow hazmat suit.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So to the point that I made real quickly, though, like the things we played with as kids, like I remember taking anything I could find and pretending it was a Star Trek communicator. I remember sticks stopped being Western era cap guns and they started being Star Trek level phasers. Sticks stopped being swords when we were fighting and became lightsabers. A lot of that stuff transitioned in our play. Chris, you made the din sound. We were all running like morons in slow motion and jumping off buildings. And I was reading, I was reading something somewhere that was saying how us kids were doing all these stupid, crazy stunts. And Lee Majors actually was quoted in one of his interviews saying that he actually had to write letters to kids telling them to stop intentionally hurting themselves because there were no bionic parts made yet. Like kids thought that if they broke their arm, they could get a bionic one. Yeah. People had to put out warnings on to kids, don't play with guns, don't do this and don't, because we really bought into all of it. And today we have it. There was a time when the first cell phones got small. We had that StarTech cell phone. Swear to God, it looked just like a Star Trek communicator. Mm-hmm. And it was called the StarTech. So it couldn't have been a mistake. They did it intentionally. Doors open for us now. Yeah. Holodecks, which were on the next generation. VR is kind of getting to the point where we can create our own environments. And, scientists have said, the scientists of our era that are now 50 and 60 years old say that that's what inspired them, seeing things on Star Trek and Star Wars and lasers and phasers. And they're like, we made what was pretend reality because of those shows.
We always talk about Gen X going from analog to digital. And in a way, even our television programming and the themes of our television programming went from an analog topic or theme all through to a digital theme, a modern theme, a futuristic theme, and everything. Like you said, the communicators. I did pretend like I was, hitting a communicator to talk. It was.
Did we? Do we include do we include Kit the car in this type
Sure.
of do we I think about Manimal. Was it called Manimal?
Manimal.
He would change into an animal, and then there was the one that they just rebooted now that's actually a pretty good television reboot, Quantum Leap.
Oh my God, yeah.
That was a good show.
Yeah. That's the kind of sci-fi that I like.
For me, sci-fi just means that it's taking scientific reality and turning it into fiction. Just what could be possible in the future. Sometimes people think that sci-fi has to be space related, and that's why you ask, would Kit count? Because it's earthbound. But no, that's science fiction just means they're putting a fictitious spin on what is possible. And then it becomes science reality somewhere down the road.
And what's crazy is some of that scientific stuff. I remember hearing about it, and I don't have the facts and stats in front of me, but I remember hearing that the B-1 bomber, which was a big deal, or the stealth bomber, that's the one I'm thinking of, the stealth bomber, when it came out, they had said that the technology for that had been back from the 50s, that the technology for it had been there. And I said, I can't remember the exacts, but then it only became a reality that many years later. So we were kind of mimicking the future when we were in the past.
Well, science always exists on paper before it exists in reality. So scientists were always able to hypothesize about the existence of black holes before we ever saw actual evidence of a black hole. A lot of the laws of physics, such as they are, it's a hypothesis, it's an idea, it's a concept.
Yeah, I wonder too, again, we're talking about kind of the sci-fi on the television side is where you wanted the focus to be, but I think about, also where we are today with AI and some of the movies in the 80s that we're already talking about it, with War Games, Terminator obviously comes to mind, and where we are in that process and how long they've actually had the AI ability has been there, and who knows how it's been used for decades. And it's just now in our hands to be able to use it in some way, shape, or form. But you have to wonder how long it's actually been, how long it's been used and how it's been used. If movies like War Games and Terminator were talking about it, was it already out there somewhere?
Well, and you said AI to movies, but Max Headroom was AI.
Yeah.
Right. In a sense, he was a person that existed in the real world, died, somehow got digitized. And there was that artificial intelligence version of him, Data, on Star Trek, was AI. He was artificial intelligence. He was an android. So that existed there too. But looking at the clock, I see that it's time to move us along a little bit. So we've talked about science fiction on television and in movies. And in that discussion, we talked about $6 Million Man, Star Trek, Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica. The thing about all of those franchises is they also led to the birth of action figures, which were toys that I know us boys definitely played with. We would never allow them to be called dolls. My Lee Majors that I could look through the back of his head, or my Luke Skywalker that had his grappling hook, my Darth Vader, all those were action figures. I'm even wearing my Superman shirt because I had all of those, not little tiny plastic action figure superheroes. I had the actual ones with the cloth clothing, and I had the Superman and the Batman and the Robin and the really creepy looking Wonder Woman, because you had to have at least one chick in the group. I had all of those. I had every Star Wars action figure there was to have, and a giant Darth Vader head that I kept them in. I loved those things, and I don't have a single one left today. I don't know. My mom Greek mommed them, as I said. Anytime we left things out, she threatened to throw them away, and off they went.
She said, that's it. I was just going to ask you, don't you wish you had some of that today? You're going on eBay going, I had that, and chalking up the numbers in your head thinking I could have been rich from what I had and threw away. But I love what you said about the girl doll being in there, because us girls with our other forms of dolls and things, we always had to have at least one boy doll, in there as well. So I feel you on that one.
Yeah, mine was, I had the action figures as well with the cloth. But where my friends and we had all the army men, if you remember those, the little green ones.
Yep.
They were probably, they weren't very big, and you would just get a bag of 100 or 50, and they'd all be different types. Some were like the medic, and other guys had a machine gun, and another guy was a sniper, and they were in different poses. And we would go into my sandbox and we would play war with these little soldiers. And those are I had some other action figures as well, but I have a picture of my stepbrother and I in the sandbox playing with those little army men.
Toy Story did a great job with the army soldiers. Like that was one of my favorite parts of how they animated and brought toys to life, was the personalities they put behind the toy soldiers, and I love that part of that.
I loved how they even walked on their single platform when they were in the Toy Story. Yeah.
Yeah, and we got to the point where you were talking about the different guns earlier too, and we had the cap guns, and so then we started actually taking the rolls of caps and turning them into bombs or whatever, I guess we would call them. Because if you set the cap roll on fire, of course it would pop, 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 pop. And so we would have all the army men set up and be like, okay, we're going to throw this right in the middle. And then whoever has more guys fall loses. And that's how we did it. So
girls played with those too. I can remember sandboxes were, I don't know if they were bigger in the day or something, because we had a giant sandbox. Like my dad trucked in a ton of sand, and we would play. We also played with the cars and the army men and things, because it was very, Barbie didn't do too well in the sand, so we, and
she probably wasn't very happy there. Yeah.
Barbie wasn't very good. But us girls played a lot of that too. And I think girls crossed over more into the quote unquote boy toys than the boys crossed over into the girl toys. Definitely. For the most part. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but back in the day, we definitely had girl toys and boy toys. And I think we crossed over more.
Well, and that's why they were called action figures, because they had to be marketed towards boys. And, if somebody put out something under the moniker of boy doll, it would have fallen flat. But I mean, let's be clear. They were dolls. They had clothes that were interchangeable. My G.I. Joe, I remember back in the day before the 80s, G.I. Joe was one guy. He was G.I. Joe. It wasn't a team like there later was in the 80s cartoons, which were basically 30-minute commercials for their toy line. He-Man, huge commercial that pretended to be a cartoon. I was a little older. I was like 14 or 15, I think, when He-Man really hit its stride and playing less with toys. But my younger brother had Manny Faces, He-Man, Battle Cat, Skeletor. I just remember the house being littered with He-Man dolls, action figures.
No, and I think too, when you're going from the 60s, and of course I didn't live in the 60s, but I can only speculate about some of the things. Toys started having a greater level of complexity to them, because I know my mother said she played with some very, very simple toys. It was a lot of blocks and a lot of those kinds of things. And pretty soon with plastics, we started seeing such an array of the dolls and action figures.
Thank you.
We started seeing the huge increase in the number of toys that were out there, their houses, their everything. And I think it was an explosion. I can't say when that happened, but I don't recall my mother describing many toys from, early 60s or anything beyond maybe a walking, barking dog, or, maybe the cap guns and the classic toys. But yeah, I think there was a huge market that came, and it probably went right along with television's sort of explosion into everybody's living room, because even television wasn't as big or common. Maybe 50s it started going, and then 60s it got more, but 70s everybody had a TV and a computer. By the time we got to the late 70s, and then everybody had a computer.
I didn't have a computer in the late 70s.
80s. But I had early computers. I guess it was early 80s, but yeah.
Yeah, I had, I think when I think of action figures, of course, almost every episode I'm going to bring up Adam Sandler in some way, shape, or form. But one of my favorite action figures that I never actually had, but was a favorite reference of mine, was in the movie Big Daddy. And it was Scuba Steve. He had the little doll Scuba Steve, and he steps on him in the morning. He's like, "Scuba Steve, damn you!" And we say that all the time now. Whenever we step on something, my friends and I were like, "Scuba Steve, damn you!" And that's that was obviously and it was later in the 90s, but still, nonetheless, that was, what toy did the 5-6-year-old kid have? He had an action figure. The action figure happened to be Scuba Steve.
Well, and you bring up a point, like you guys mentioned sandboxes, which I don't think were necessarily bigger back then. I think we were smaller. My fat ass would have to shoehorn itself into a sandbox right now. So, yeah, a lot of things from my youth looked bigger back then than they do now.
That's a good point.
That said, but our toys, our action figures traveled with us. I took them with me when we would take trips, and I'd play in the car. Bath time was huge. Like you mentioned Scuba Steve. If I had an Aquaman or a Scuba, G.I. Joe action figure, that bastard went in the tub with me. And I mean, our fingers and toes would be pruny as hell because we didn't want to get out of the bathtub. Number one, because our mom forgot we were there. Childhood drownings must have been a major thing in the 70s. But number two, because we had our toys in there. And when my mom wasn't doing what I referred to as lovingly waterboarding me with just like piles and piles of water over my head, I was playing with my action figures in the tub.
The girls had a version too where they actually specifically made toys for the tub, and there was a little mermaid type things, and they had little sponge lily pads, and you played with those, and they changed colors and did things. And that was the intent. You stayed in the bathtub for an hour.
Well, and those were action figures. I mean, I look at what Wonder Woman dolls, Jamie Summer dolls, were girls playing with those? Was that an effort to market action figures to girls, or were us guys just buying those too and playing with them? I never, like I said, I had the $6 Million Man action figure. I didn't have the Jamie Summers. I did have Wonder Woman. I did have Batgirl. I think they were gifted to me because, and this is going to sound horribly sexist, but because the superheroes needed to save someone. And in my mind, the girl superheroes were the ones that always got captured. All you had to be was a kid in the 70s to see chloroform was everywhere in the 70s. Apparently it was real easy to get because every heroine, every female superhero at one time or another had, yes, Rochelle's putting her hand over her face. But even Wonder Woman, who's supposed to be so strong and so powerful, it's like, nope, over the mouth, down she goes. Every single one of them. Like there was not a week in 70s television that a superhero didn't fall into quicksand or get taken out by chloroform.
Wait, so you're telling me you chloroformed your Wonder Woman doll? I'm sorry, your Wonder Woman action figure. I'm sorry. See, I didn't,
but the Joker might have on a time or two, on an occasion.
And you give me a hard time about the way I wear my hats. And here you are.
It's played. That's how you play. Somebody needs to be saved. Listen, the person that created, this? Get into a little Wonder Woman history. I actually know a lot about this. Number one, part of the big reason Wonder Woman sold so well in the 50s and 60s was people with BDSM issues were reading it. The guy who invented it had her, if you bound Wonder Woman by a chain crossing her bracelets, she lost all power. So like every other episode was somebody trying to tie her up. So I didn't start it. It was put into the storyline.
This sounds like a whole other episode.
Yeah, well, I didn't intend for it to go this way, but we get here one way or the other.
The dirty edition.
I'm just
their podcast dirty
edition. Come on, she wore basically like a bustier for a superhero costume. She tied you up with her rope. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. It writes itself. Chris?
Thank you for putting that image in my head now. Seriously, I just liked her lasso. All right, now you're telling me her lasso had another purpose, and now I can't unsee it. I can't unhear it.
I mean, I don't even know where to go from here. Except maybe I'll just say it wouldn't be shocking to know that John also had a Bette Midler action figure.
Take a drink, folks.
Beneath your wings.
31 minutes and 24 seconds. Take a drink. Well, and I was going to say that these action figures also had like accessories. Like if there was a Tom Hanks action figure from Castaway, he'd probably have a little Wilson ball that would get lost.
It's true. Yeah.
No,
it's yeah.
And we always lost them. Like none of my Star Wars action figures kept the lightsaber for very long. If they had the accessories always disappeared.
No. That's boy speak right there. Girl speak, though. When you had a Barbie doll, she had shoes that were literally smaller than your pinky because they always had to be high heels, by the way. Even her foot was curved to be perma high heeled. and you didn't lose a single pair of them. You
That sounds
did not.
impossible.
Us girls would sit there and we would line them up and keep them in their little cases, and wherever we had to, they were not lost. Now that's a boy thing. Mm-hmm.
So when you started talking about accessories, two things. One is a lot of my action figures were Dungeons and Dragons action figures because I got into that.
Why am I not surprised?
And so they all had accessories. They all had their weapons, and the monsters had their accessories. And so, yes, I agree with you. Like within a matter of not very long, a guy would go from having a sword in one hand and a battle axe in the other to just being like this with nothing in it.
Or you'd make do. I remember using toothpicks for lightsabers once a lightsaber got lost.
I actually when you started talking about accessories, I thought about it wasn't an action figure necessarily, but Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head. I mean, that was I had both, and you would have all the little pieces that you could move around to make different faces, and that was accessorizing a figure, a doll, whatever you want to call it. But those were huge, and they came, I think, I mean, maybe somebody can fact check us on this, but I think Mr. and Miss Potato Head were probably before a lot of these action figures that we're talking about.
Way before.
Oh, they were definitely, because if I'm not mistaken, they were invented with a real potato. They were meant to be on a real potato. That's what I had heard years ago. I don't even know
really?
if it's true. That's
Maybe
what I
in
had
Pennsylvania.
Heard. Somebody. Okay, we made our own potato heads.
I'm just seeing little Rochelle at age 5 with a giant spud, 4 twigs, and 3 pebbles, and her parents saying, "Merry Christmas."
You guys go ahead and talk.
Oh, you're gonna find it? You're gonna Google it?
Potato head.
So while Rochelle's looking at that, the last thing I will say on this segment is she's absolutely right, though, that there was a toy explosion in the 70s and 80s directed at kids. And I think I mentioned in a previous podcast is there was legislation that protected children against being marketed to unconsciously through our television programming. And that legislation changed in the very early 80s, which is what led to He-Man and G.I. Joe as a team and all those things. Before then, you had to look pretty hard to find a Star Trek toy. Even though the desire was out there, we didn't have many of them. And they were never really strongly advertised on the show. I watched Star Trek every single episode, $6 Million Man, every single episode. But I don't remember even once there being a commercial during the show selling the products. It was not allowed. So when it changed, that's when it went nuts.
Strawberry Shortcake is the first one that I can think of that was literally one big long cartoon, mainly to advertise the product.
Yeah.
And I wonder too,
Smurfs.
before Fraggle Rock, although they didn't really do that much merchandising with it, I guess, but it was awesome nonetheless, because you said the Smurfs and I love Fraggle Rock. So, but I was also thinking about it. I wonder if there was something, and this is maybe too deep for us to talk about, but psychologically going on in the sense that the games that I remember when I was, or the toys, I should say, until a certain point, maybe almost 10 years old, they were board games designed for families to get around and play. So it was like Candyland. I mean, as you got older, it was Life and Monopoly, but but I remember having Candyland and Chutes and Ladders. And these were games that everybody could play. The parents could play with their 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and everybody could have a good time. And then we get into the 80s, and John's probably right here that it's much more of a business thing than anything else. However, what action figures did and toys like that was it allowed a kid to play on his own or her own. And that was something that was beginning to happen in the 80s. Sometimes, we had the latchkey kids, we had, a lot of divorce, and I don't want to go to it's a dark place or anything.
No,
but
it's not a dark place. It's how a
real
lot of us grew up.
Something.
And it gave a kid an opportunity to be able to feel like they were attached to something, that they had, a friend, or they had something to do while they're waiting for their parents to come home from work. I'm just throwing it out there as maybe that was something as well.
No, I definitely think you're onto it.
Yeah, I think you have an excellent point that we could immerse ourselves in something else. Either it was outside, but if it was a rainy day, you needed something to keep you occupied. It was either television or it was the toys that you were playing with. So I can see that. I like your thinking there.
Well, thanks.
Well done.
I mean, it wasn't like pickup sticks. If you ever played that, pickup sticks or jacks.
Rochelle looks like the cat that ate the canary. I've seen you use technology, Rochelle. I'm just impressed you were able to do it without your phone blowing up the entire podcast.
I turned it off now. I'm using my computer. Listen, in its original form, Mr. Potato Head was offered as separate plastic parts with push pins to be attached into a real potato or other vegetable. Thank you. Mic drop. There we go. Yes. See, somewhere in the back of my brain is so much useless knowledge. I can't sometimes get it to the forefront, but I usually alien letters and okay, alien letters were real, and now Mr. Potato Head with the real potato. Yep. Mm-hmm.
We're never going to be able to shut her up after this. She's going to be like, Rochelle, I don't think you're right. Like I wasn't right. Mr. Potato Head.
And it could have been another vegetable. That's the craziest thing about it.
And we don't even know that she was reading anything. Let's be honest.
Mr.
She could have been staring at a black screen on a powered down phone for all we know. So, bringing us back to the purpose of our podcast, we have completed 2 sections. So, science fiction, action figures, and it just makes sense that the next logical place we're going is Sandra Bullock. Because
it's so logical.
Well, she was in the movie Demolition Man, which was a great science fiction movie. And as a result of that, she actually had an action figure made of her. Completes our segment perfectly. And that's how those 3 items relate to one another. But it doesn't reveal the hidden thing that connects all 3 of them. So let's take a few minutes and talk about Sandra Bullock. The greatest thing about her not being Demolition Man, I always think of her as another Julia Roberts. Honestly, in the late 80s into the 90s, she was everywhere. Thoughts? Discussion?
Yeah. I think of her on a bus. I mean, that's the first place I see her is speeding along on a bus, trying to get for speed.
Yeah, and I love Sandra Bullock, and I think Julia Roberts, yes, with a very strong comedic bent. Like her comedic timing is great, and throughout all the movies that I've seen her in, she just has great comedic timing, and that's very, very difficult to do. It's not easy. Comedy is not easy, and so when somebody can do that as well as she does, and then of course. I had mentioned that Notting Hill was probably my favorite out of from away from the 80s, my favorite rom-com. But my second favorite rom-com that's not 80s is The Proposal with Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds. And I just think it's great. I mean, I think it's a fun movie. It's funny. She's, like I said, the comedic timing, if you've seen the movie, when she interacts with Betty White at one point in the movie, it's just absolute comedy gold. She's really good. Yeah.
Have you seen it, Chelle?
What's that?
Have you seen The Proposal?
No, I don't think that I have. I mean, you mention it, and maybe once, if anything, and it might not have left an impression on me.
I think if you saw it, it would. I just saw it for the first time. It's funny you bring it up, like 2 weeks ago, and I thought it was hilarious. Yeah, Betty White is awesome in it. Ryan Reynolds was awesome in it. It does everything a rom-com is supposed to do. It was funny. It was sweet. It's what we used to call date movies. Great date movie.
Yeah,
she was really good in the one with the football player, The
Blind Side.
The Blind Side. Yeah, I think you could see that she can go from an action to comedic to a very serious role, and she's incredibly well-rounded in that way.
Absolutely. And to your point, I first saw her in Speed. Well, that's not true. I think she was in a couple other things. But Speed was definitely what made an impression for me. And Keanu Reeves, and then she was in was there 2 sequels? I know she was in the second one. I don't know if that was Jason Patric on the boat or if there was a third one with Jason Patric. I think it was just 2. But Keanu Reeves isn't in the sequel. Jason Patrick from Lost Boys ends up coming in on the sequel. That's neither here nor there. But she played it perfectly, you know, and Dennis Hopper was in that. And I think that was like a huge movie. And then we saw her in things like, what's the one where she's the FBI agent and pretending to be a beauty queen?
I can see her in the walking out, trying to walk in heels and getting frustrated.
But that showcased her comedic talent big time. She was hilarious in that.
Yeah.
While you were sleeping, there were just so many. Miscongeniality. And that was in 2000, I think. But I did look it up, and she was almost in a movie every single year from like 1989 to 1990. From 1989 to like 2001, she did one after another, and almost all of them were hits. I think her and Julia Roberts broke the mold in the fact that they were able to be a female actor and actress and carry a movie to success at the box office by themselves. They didn't need Keanu Reeves or Ryan Reynolds. They by themselves were able to carry the movie. And I think Miscongeniality absolutely proved that.
Yeah, and then she also was in some sci-fi movies as well. Bird Box and
I haven't seen that one.
It's good.
Oh.
It's scary. And then Gravity is another. Yeah. Gravity was a great one. I think that was a great movie. It didn't get a lot of play, like maybe like an Interstellar, but it's very good.
Was Gravity with George Clooney?
Yeah.
Okay, I did see that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Bird Box, if anybody out there is listening to this, if you've never seen Bird Box, watch it. But before you do, read the book. The book is absolutely amazing.
I've never seen it and I've never read the book, but I will definitely write it down.
Yeah, I could watch it over and over again, but I'm telling you, the book is even better.
Yeah, it's on Netflix. It's really good. And then to your point, John, with the comedic stuff, she just did The Lost City. And I just watched that. It was actually pretty good too. I think it was with Channing Tatum. Yeah. And she's still, you know, she just has that great comedic timing.
You know, and this is not to bring up a sore spot for her, but I remember when she was married to the motorcycle guy. I can't think of his name right.
Jesse James.
Jesse James. Yes. I remember being heartbroken when her and Jesse James broke up. Because she was like America's sweetheart at that point. And he broke up with her for, I think it was Kat Von D, if I'm recalling correctly. And we all just were like, how could you leave this wonderful, sweet, beautiful woman? You know, of course, we don't know what goes on behind closed doors, but that was a big scandal in the day.
Shell's got her People magazine like this. Like, what? No! Oh my God!
No!
I'm just thinking it's like she's speaking a different language. It's like Kat Von D or whatever you said. I'm like, nothing. I got no clue.
She's a tattoo artist, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And she makeup lines and different things like that. She just was, you know, and she all tattooed. She looks like her and Jesse James look like they kind of belong together. Jesse James never actually looked like he belonged with, you know, not to be judgmental on looks, but he didn't look like he belonged with America's sweetheart. She looked like she should be married to somebody that was like clean cut and everything. You know,
Ryan Reynolds, proposal.
I think Chelle wrote a letter to the editor after they broke up. She must have said she's.
I was sad.
Was it an alien letter?
It was an alien letter.
If I've said it before, I'll say it again. If anybody is watching these podcasts out of order, go back. Go back. The sound quality wasn't as good. You know, we were working out some kinks, but I promise you, there's a lot of inside jokes you're not going to understand if you're jumping in on, you know, episode 6 or you gotta do the work. You gotta do the work. Or you're not going to understand some of these amazing inside jokes.
And those inside jokes make this just all the more reason that I love sitting here with you two each and every week.
Me too. Yes. Absolutely. I mean, any chance I can get to talk about Bette Midler, I'm in. So, I mean, I want to go. I do. You know, again, like in terms of Sandra Bullock, what's always been for me, and they don't. I'm not saying they look alike, but they do remind each of each other for me. And it's Marissa Tomei and Sandra Bullock, and I think it's maybe because they had a similar arc in terms of when they became really popular. Speed was 1989 or 90,
Mhm.
1990,
90, maybe 89. I think it was 80 still, but could have been 90.
So there's, Sandra Bullock really, getting on in front of everybody at that moment, even though she'd done some stuff before. And then you had 1992, My Cousin Vinny with Marissa Tomei. And so they just kind of hit at the same time. I don't know. For me, it's not that I mix them up at all, but I do kind of look at both of them and I say it's interesting to watch how those two actresses, who are both incredible. I mean, if Marissa Tomei and The Wrestler, if you never saw The Wrestler, do yourself a favor and watch it. It's Mickey Rourke and Marissa Tomei, and Mickey Rourke plays an retired or old pro wrestler who's just kind of lost everything. He lives in a trailer. He's taking pain pills all the time. He's so beat up. He does these wrestling matches at high schools to make $50. And Marissa Tomei is a dancer, stripper. And he meets her. Maybe I'm getting it wrong. Ex-stripper. Maybe that's in her past life. Anyway, they meet. It's a great, just trust me, The Wrestler. Really, really good movie. It's not for the kids. It's definitely like the adults watching the movie, but it's very good.
Chris, I love how you're able to take our discussion in places I don't see it going. Mm-hmm. That said, sometimes I forget what our topics are listening to you. I literally had to back up. I'm like, wait, Marissa Tomei, who the hell are we supposed to be talking about?
Sandra Bullock.
Yeah, but I got lost for a minute, and it's valid, and I'm glad, but I have to make fun of you every chance I get. But I literally, honestly, it's more on my senior brain than it is your tangent ability. I just literally lost where you were for a minute, and I'm like, Cousin Vinny? I'm like, what is it that we're talking about?
You have to know here's to everybody here, including the two of you, but to the audience. If I recommend something that's not 80s, it's probably going to be pretty good because I'm still stuck in those 80s. And so if something catches my attention outside of the 80s and I say, hey, this is pretty good, could be wrong, but I think you'll enjoy it.
So getting back to like the movie she did, I got to say my favorite had to be Speed. I mean, I know I brought it up a couple of times. I remember I would drive every weekend. So I went to school in Buffalo and my parents we grew up and had a bar and a restaurant like about 2 hours east of there. And every weekend I had to drive home in order to work. And I remember that 120-mile trek, and I would try not to let it get under 55. Because a lot of it was like on the New York State Thruway. And I remember playing games, dangerous games as it turns out, because I didn't want to slow down for cars that were cutting me off because I would explode and nearly cause more than a few accidents. But I literally remember playing Speed all the way home.
Listen, you are such a boy. There's just no, girl, we did not do that. I'm telling you, we did not go, whether Sandra Bullock did it or not. That is such a boy thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think about Speed and it being, now again, maybe there were movies that were done like this before, but Speed to me was almost like the evolution from Speed was 24.
Yeah,
and because it was all right there on this bus essentially, and the entire movie you're right there with the passengers. And whatever happens to them, you feel like is going to happen to you because you're right there in it with them for an hour and 40 minutes. And I don't know, maybe there were movies that were done like that before where there was a clock that was ticking the entire movie and you, the audience, were just so engaged with it. I don't know. It seems to me like that started a little bit of a genre, which is pretty cool.
And not related to the topic that I've hidden from the two of you, but there was a character in Speed, an actor that plays back to a movie we bring up all the time. Either of you remember?
Beaches?
One of the passengers on the bus?
Beaches?
No, not Beaches. Maybe he had to take the bus because he wrecked his dad's car and didn't have anything to drive.
Ferris?
Cameron.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Cameron was on the bus.
That's right.
I'm shocked.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I was playing around with topics, that's how I got to Sandra Bullock and then backed my way into my actual topic. For those that don't do this, that's a huge part of what makes this show fun for the host is you have to you almost come into it backwards. And part of what got me to Speed is we filmed our Thanksgiving episode last week. even though there are episodes that have played between the two. And Cameron helped lead me to where I ended up, because he made some really cool cameos. And Rochelle, you talk all the time about how there's hidden connections we don't intend.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about science fiction, Cameron was also in the Star Trek, one of the Star Trek movies. He was a Star Trek captain on board the ship. I think it was First Contact. He was in Star Trek, the movie, as well. So just a little side thing. I don't know how he connects to action figures, but there's probably a Cameron action figure out there somewhere.
Yeah.
But that's not the connection. But I thought it was cool. It was
cool.
unintended connection.
Yes.
If there is a Cameron action figure, I'm going to find it.
Yeah.
Speed, by the way, I had to look it up because it was 1994.
Wow.
I
So
swore
just 10
that
years
was
ago.
like a 5 years ago.
Not long ago.
I swore that was a 1989-90 movie, but no, it was 1994. And by the way, you know, she also did that. I haven't seen it yet, but she was in the movie with most recently On a Train.
Seriously.
Yeah, Bullet Train.
Is it like Speed? It can't slow down?
With Brad Pitt. I think he was more like trying to escape assassins or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was supposed to, I mean, I don't know. I heard good things about it. Just high action, but you saw it?
Yeah, I didn't. Did
she have a big part?
I don't even recall her being in it, but that maybe that's because I didn't care for the movie that much. So I got bored with it. You tend not to notice the other characters or the actors or whoever's in it because it's not memorable enough to you. So you just,
Or maybe she wasn't. Yeah, she
wasn't in it at all.
No, I just looked it up, and she actually is. I thought she was in it, so I had to look it up. I'm going to do like a Chelle thing here. And yeah, I'm just looking at it right now. She's
do a mic drop.
Her name was Maria in it, but I don't even see her in the main cast. So she must have just maybe had like a little, you know, she just did like a little cameo type of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right. Well, it looks like we've exhausted some knowledge the two of you bring to the table when it comes to Sandra Bullock. So I will continue us on, but I'd like to know what is going on in those brains of yours. What do you think? Like, the Cameron would have been a really cool connection had I decided to go that route, which I did not. So where do you think I went with this?
My first thought, I had the movie Gravity in mind as soon as you mentioned sci-fi. And I know you said Sandra Bullock. I had recalled, I'm like, oh, wait, George Clooney. I couldn't remember the name of the movie. And then talking about the action figures and how they had exploded out as the space race during the space race kind of thing. So my thought was some sort of a space connection between them. That was my first thinking.
Okay, couldn't be more wrong.
Probably, yeah. I assumed so.
You were actually closer with Mr. Potato Head. I'm joking, Chelle. I'm joking.
Zucchini, Mr. Zucchini Head.
Chris, what do you got, man?
I really don't have anything. I
tried plugging. I said it over and over again through the podcast.
You kept saying robots. You kept going back to robots, which I started thinking like, is there something that I'm missing, a connection with Sandra Bullock and robots?
It's a fine line to keep bringing something up because you want to bring the people along without crossing over, because I think it loses something. Not that it's ever happened, but if we get the connection in like the first, something gets lost in the episode, and it's never happened. It probably never will. Well, let me tell you this.
Wait! Don't tell us yet. Give us another chance. We're telling you, give us another chance. Yeah. Give us something. Give us another thing.
So, Chris, you seem to have access to looking things up. What was Sandra Bullock's debut role? Do you know?
I mean, like way back, or the one that really put her on the map?
On screen, at least from my research, her first on screen debut is what ties pretty much everything all together.
I mean, I'm looking it up now. So she goes back to a movie called Hangmen back in 1987. But then
So her first role where she actually had an on screen named
A Fool and His Money?
Bionic Showdown.
Bionic Showdown. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay.
She actually played an athlete that was tapped by the OSI to become the next generation bionic woman in a movie with Lee Majors and Jamie Summers, who was played by, oh my God, I'm just drawing a blank. Lindsay Wagner.
You mentioned Lee Majors so many times, too.
So many times. And the $6 Million Man, so many times.
Yeah.
Because the connection is literally the $6 Million Man. It was a science fiction show that I was absolutely and totally nuts about in the 70s. I had
the action figures, and then
I had the look through the back of his head. One of the best action figures ever made. You could literally roll up the rubber skin on his arm.
Yeah, you could.
And it showed his bionic arm. You could look through the back of his head, and it had the special effect they used in the television show to use his bionic eye. One of the best, we talked about it in other podcasts, Bionic Woman and the $6 Million Man. The crossover episodes were one of the first times we could watch shows where a character from one ended up on another. And one of my favorite moments as a kid was begging my parents to stay up because we were killed by cliffhangers as kids. Oh, to be continued.
Oh, yeah.
But what the $6 Million Man is, it said to be continued on the Bionic Woman coming up next. So the cliffhanger was literally answered immediately on the next episode right after. And then finally, it followed us as we grew from 70s into the 80s, into the 90s with all these shows that they had as specials. Because everybody always wondered what happened. What happened to Steve Austin and Jamie Summers? And we got to see these reunion shows that they made over and over again. That I just thought were super cheesy, but super cool, because rarely do we get to see our favorite characters age with us. And we got to see them get married, and we got to see a next generation of bionics. And it wasn't just that they remade the show, it's they kept the show going for over 20 years.
Yeah, like you said, having kids. You know, I don't recall that, by the way.
It wasn't their kid. So he had an illegitimate kid that was in the movie. His actual son, Lee Majors Jr., was also in the Bionic Showdown, which was kind of cool to see. But it's just showing better special effects. And the new Bionics were better than the old Bionics. And yet these old people, because Lee Majors and Lindsay Wagner were they'd gotten on by the time these shows came on. And they were still cool. They were still relevant in their 50s. They were still able to leap tall buildings in a single bound in their 50s. They were still there and the heroes of the story. They remained the main characters in their 50s. And I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I can still do that. I can still leap tall buildings in a single bound.
I can too. I mean, I'll have to call an ambulance afterwards, but you know what I mean? So I might just trip myself walking across the room. I don't know, but yeah, it's still, but it is neat though, because we're older and we're still cool. I mean, at least I think I am. I don't care if anybody else does, but
leaping is never my problem. Landing is my problem. My knees can handle the leap. They can't always handle the landing.
I love the connection. I would have never, I wouldn't have gotten it. I would not have gotten it. But now when I think about it, yes, the action figures there were so many of them in the 80s, but the $6 Million Man, I had that one. Once you started talking about rolling up the skin, I remember that now. Yeah, totally. It was so cool. And you could, I don't know. I loved the show as well. So, for me, I really enjoyed the show. And by the way, Lee Majors and Lindsay Summers, have they both passed?
No, neither. Lee Majors and Lindsay Wagner are both with us.
Good. Well, that's good. Maybe they can do a reboot.
I wouldn't be shocked to see it. They still do different things that they pop up. And we talk about pop culture. $6 Million Man was pop culture. I had the lunchbox and the thermos. I can still see it when I close my eyes. We talked about accessories. They had the Bionic Lab where you could work on his bionics. You had the rocket that took off, which caused him to get hurt in the first place and get the bionics. We all remember the intro. That, we're going to create the world's first bionic man. We have the technology. We can make him better, stronger, faster.
Yeah.
To me, my favorite connections are those that bring pop culture alive in a way that kids today would not really get.
Mm-hmm.
There's not TV shows anymore. There's streaming episodes on Netflix that 9, 10, 12 episodes and then go away for 3 years. Kids don't grow up with shows as much like this as we did. And for me, it was super cool. And it doesn't have to be $6 Million Man. Chelle, I don't know if you have a connection with that show, but there was a show that did that for you.
Yeah, but going back to what you said about watching a show and not having grown up with one and anticipating that cliffhanger ending, it kind of occurred to me there aren't a lot of cliffhanger endings because it was a true cliffhanger for us. Like you said, if it went to the next episode on the Bionic Woman, but we often had to wait a week and you had to make sure you were sitting down in front of that television at that time. So when you talk about cliffhanger, you scheduled your life around, depending on the show, sitting down to watch it because there was no way you couldn't record. Well, you had a VCR for some people, but depending on when, the 70s did that too. 70s, 80s. Yeah.
Shows had they didn't have such a bar to exceed in order to get put back. So a lot of the shows we loved would never have made it to a second season today. If they don't grab an audience immediately, they're gone. So there's a reason they don't do cliffhangers so much anymore. It's because a lot of times they'll do them and the show won't return and it just pisses people off.
Yeah,
then we're running to the internet, as you say, from show to show saying what happened. Will somebody let me know what happened? Yeah. We had to wait till the next week or the next season. Who Shot JR was interrupted by a strike, for Christ's sakes. So it really extended it and people had to wait. But that's what made these cool. It jumped from one show to the next. And in some cases had to cross networks because the Bionic Woman in her final season moved from ABC, where it was canceled, to NBC. So it actually was on a completely different network. And they had some of the most monumental crossovers, the Bigfoot, Sasquatch episode, the Fembot episodes, just these huge story arcs that as a kid, I can still see them. I still love them. And when I watch them, they didn't age badly. They're still pretty good.
And you said about the kids today and you growing up with them, I can't think of anything that my kids would say it has impacted them so much. Like, will we be talking about some Netflix drama, that maybe had 3 seasons 30 years from now? Are my kids going to talk about something like that? I seriously don't think so. There's not that many of them.
My daughter will bring up things like iCarly or what was the Miley Cyrus, on those shows, but they're still not the same. And those were still going back 20 years now.
Oh yeah, they're still, yeah.
Yeah. And I also think too, like the shows that we grew up with, I think about it like the movies. And so they had these limited ways to generate revenue around their property. So for the movies, we've talked about that. Once they had the box office and then it was, Blockbuster, there was no streaming. There was the international box office was there, but nothing like it is today. And so they had limitations. And same with, I think, with television, they were looking around and saying, how do we create more revenue from this property that we have? And of course, Star Wars really did that. I don't know if they did it first, but they did it best at that time. And then from there, I think everybody started looking around and thinking, why can't we do this as well? And so they did. And then we talked about the action figures, but I mentioned the lunch boxes, obviously the T-shirts that you have. But I mean, there was all of this stuff that we had at school that we could get that was branded with at the school supply store, at the Scholastic book fairs, that were branded with these different shows.
I think I might have had not a Trapper Keeper, but it was a data center or some kind of, and that was branded with the shows. I think I might have had a $6 Million Man folder of some kind that was branded. And then one other hidden connection I wanted to make that I thought also tied it together before I forget. I kept asking about Miss Congeniality because that was a trope. There was an episode of The Bionic Woman who was an OSI agent that had to infiltrate a beauty pageant in order to uncover a criminal. So she did it before Sandra Bullock did it in an episode of The Bionic Woman.
Wow.
That's cool.
And that was something that came back a couple times. Wonder Woman also had to do it as an agent and that was like, it was a trope back in the 70s because what else would a woman agent do but infiltrate a beauty pageant? Well. And Miss Congeniality flipped it on its head, and kind of made a joke about it. Like they made fun of the pageants while doing it and still found a sweet moment at the end.
I actually love when I have no idea what the connection is, because I really get excited for the reveal. And John, so far, I've been stumped by both of you. But in particular, John, this one really stumped me because all three things that you talked about, I have fairly decent knowledge of. And so I thought for sure I could put the connection together. But first of all, I would love to know how what was it that you came up with the six? Did you start with the $6?
I always start with I always start with the thing that's going to be the reveal, and then try to back into 3 topics. So I mean, there you got it. I mean, in a long, convoluted way, that's the thought process sometimes, and sometimes the reveal comes before the 3 topics. But at any rate, I didn't think you guys get the last one, but I thought it'd be one of those episodes where you're like, science fiction, action figures. I'm thinking $6 Million Man. I don't know how Sandra Bullock comes into it, but no matter how many times I said it, you guys did not take the bait.
No, we didn't. We should be ashamed of ourselves. We got to do better.
I wouldn't have been able to connect the dots, I think, no matter how many clues you gave me. I think it was the Sandra Bullock that just kind of threw me off.
And that's going to be my MO every time. It's going to be 2, and then what?
And then
I did it with, I did it with Pop Rock's Phil Collins and a gerbil. That's my MO. That's the way I roll. So that's it. That's my episode. For John Catrides, aka Gen X Jono, this is me signing off. Thanking you guys for watching, subscribing, and sharing this little tiny adventure that we're having fun bringing to you.
And I'm Gen X Show, and I totally appreciate everyone being here. Like and subscribe to our channel. Find us on Spotify and everywhere that you listen to your popular podcasts.
And I'm Chris Clues, better known as Chris Clues. And I will just also say, please make sure to subscribe and listen to us across podcast platforms and on YouTube as well. Follow us on Facebook. We put some fun stuff up there for you. And of course, stay rad, everybody.
See ya.